If you're a pilot, you've probably seen at least a few videos of mishaps on the runway. Ground loop videos are all over YouTube, for example. There's plenty of instructional material on how to land an airplane, and this includes recovering from errors like bouncing, porpoising, or wheelbarrowing. I'm not going to reinvent the wheel with my video here. What does seem to be missing, however, is an understanding of what gets us to make these errors in the first place. Simply saying these pilots are incompetent doesn't get us any benefit. In fact, many of these pilots are experienced, skilled, and competent in their fields. Let's investigate how we work during these critical seconds. My name's John. I have planes. Let's fly these crashes. We're going to look at the crash of this Kitfox in Arizona. It had just been built and was going out on its very first test flight. Because the owner did not have much time, he hired a test pilot with 13,000 hours of total time, about 1,000 hours of tailwheel, a clean record, but only 33 hours in tight to do this first flight. The owner went along to monitor engine data. Here is the video of the accident sequence itself. Let's watch. Pay attention to the airplane's control surfaces. You can see the pilot is flying the airplane all the way to the first touchdown. During the bounce, the controls become fixed, and this is not unusual. After the second touchdown, it seems aileron inputs stop for a while. Once a small roll is corrected, it seems the pilot returns to making normal control corrections. At this point, something, perhaps a tailwheel shimmy, causes the pilot to add power. No rudder or aileron correction is observable from this point to the end of the accident sequence. When I watch this video, I have to be honest. It makes me scratch my head. And commentary from others who watch it are similarly unsparing of the pilot in command's performance. But if this person was uniquely unfit for this flight, this would be a unique or a rare event. The problem is this is not unique or rare at all. There are plenty of videos of airplanes losing control on landing, especially of ground loops. There are massive numbers of accidents that populate a simple search of NTSB records if we use the keyword ground loop. And these are only the records we know about that are publicly available. Were all of these pilots simply undertrained and out of their element? Were all of these individual pilots simply inept? The number of accidents, I believe, tells a different story. I believe the numbers are really showing us that somewhere in these accident sequences, the pilots are becoming mentally overwhelmed. So long before we discuss the merits of this technique over another, we really need to talk about how our minds are working in the cockpit during periods of high tasking like takeoff and landing. So for the sake of discussion, let's imagine that our mind is a machine. Let's pretend it's like a little engine. In reality, our minds do not function like machinery or computers, but for the sake of this video, please humor me. Our mind is busy making decisions, so we'll pretend it's a decision engine. We feed our engine information that we take in through all kinds of observations, and we make those observations via our many senses. The mind machinery then orients that information based on the knowledge it has, and it produces decisions. Those decisions then get turned into smart actions. Then the whole cycle starts all over again. Obviously, a lot of flying depends on us turning smart decisions into smart actions. So we need to understand what makes us work well and what breaks us down. Every material thing has a limit. Machines, brains, whiskey barrels, whatever. If we stay within our mind's limits, within the limits of our decision engine, we keep making smart decisions, and those smart decisions keep getting turned into smart action. If we load ourselves up with tasking to the point that we approach, but don't cross the limit of what our minds can handle, we still make okay decisions, but those okay decisions result in hairy but still acceptable actions. If we push it too far, we start making errors. The further past our limits we go, the worse those errors become. So let's use a cartoon plane and cartoon plastic pilot. During a normal crosswind landing, the pilot is busy but certainly not overloaded. Crosswind correction needs to be applied, and the pilot is reading the situation. His mind is very rapidly deciding what is needed now and anticipating what will be needed soon. Appropriate control inputs are applied as the airplane's windward, then leeward main wheels touch, tail settles, etc. Through the whole maneuver, the pilot's mind keeps collecting information, processing that information into decisions, and turning those decisions into appropriate, we call them smart, control inputs. The pilot's mind is continually active, but nowhere near overtaxed. This is similar to riding a bicycle. Just like riding a bicycle, the pilot is using both explicit and implicit memory and learning throughout this maneuver. Implicit memory and learning is basically our muscle memory. So for the example that we see here, people riding dirt bikes, they're implicitly maintaining balance on their bikes, cornering, shifting gears, etc. Explicit memory and learning are things like conscious decisions that we make. So for the people racing dirt bikes, they're consciously making choices about what gear to be in, what lines to take, how to strategize through the race. Explicit and implicit memory and learning are linked. It takes a lot of practice to build up that implicit learning, and that implicit learning is perishable. So what happens as we start to overwhelm our pilot or our flight crew? Well, at first, implicit skills keep working and our pilot is able to detect and correct appropriately for gusts. In fact, more brain power is being absorbed by the part of our brain responsible for implicit skills. That means some explicit tasking has to be dropped, and non-essential details will be sacrificed. So, for example, in the flare, the pilot might not notice a momentary jolt on the amp meter. And this is a good thing, because it allows the pilot to focus on aircraft control when aircraft control needs to be his focus. As we start to touch the pilot's limits, things start to break down. How this breakdown occurs varies pilot by pilot, situation by situation, flight crew by flight crew, etc. So for example, in some cases, pilots start to fixate on one issue at the expense of others. So altitude control absorbs the pilot's ability to maintain speed or directional control. When the pilot is at but not beyond his limits, the pilot will start falling behind the airplane, so to speak. But when we're at our pretend yellow light, our pilot can still catch back up to the plane and get the flight and the pilot's mind back on track. When a pilot's workload gets to a point that he's task saturated, things begin to fall apart. But this time they keep getting worse. This is where our imaginary brain status indicator is in the red. Earlier, it was a good thing when our brain dropped unnecessary tasks in order to focus on immediate needs. Now, necessary things start to be sacrificed in order to meet demands that the pilot explicitly or implicitly prioritizes. So if the pilot becomes focused on yaw control, he may drop roll inputs, which, on landing, may be counterintuitive. Worse still, our brains may revert to earlier habits, say from driving a car, and cause us to apply counterproductive control inputs. So the pilot is momentarily saturated, and that leads to some kind of undesired state. That undesired state in turn increases the pilot's workload, and fewer corrective actions are applied. The airplane's condition then deteriorates further, and the pilot may stop control inputs entirely. We're going to look at a study done by the University of Missouri. A number of pilots were put into a simulator, and they were told to fly a test pattern of climbs, descents, turns, etc. Researchers measured deviations from the planned flight path as they changed pilot workload. With occasional distractions, pilots flew the pattern. With increased distractions, predictably, deviations increased and pilots flew off altitude, off course, etc. With an emergency workload, pilots' course and altitude adherence actually improved. In this case, they focused on flight path management and deprioritized ancillary tasks. If we stay within our personal limits, we have successful outcomes. If we know we're in trouble, we tend to rise to the occasion. We explicitly deprioritize irrelevant tasks and focus on flying the airplane. I believe the Missouri study shows us that we're most vulnerable when we're trying to salvage our first plan, but before we switch to contingency plan B, plan C, plan D, etc. And we can see this played out in a few different practical ways. For example, in a spin, it takes an explicit realization, a trigger, to know that we can no longer pull to raise the nose or roll the aileron to lift the downward wing. A new implicit routine is triggered when we realize we're in a spin, and we go through our well-practiced spin recovery procedure. Without that trigger, outcomes can be very bad. If our implicit processing is still okay, but our explicit processing is compromised, we make deeply faulty decisions. Just like before, it takes some trigger to get us to take a breath, reassess the situation along with our goals, and perhaps stop a chain of bad decisions from progressing further. Without that trigger, just like before, outcomes can be very bad. So it seems everything is riding on us being able to close the gap between our capabilities and our various escape triggers. So let's go back to the Kitfox crash that we're talking about, and let's consider some of the pressures the pilot may have been feeling. Whether we like it or not, career pressure often makes it into the cockpit. This pilot was into a career that he had built around general aviation in the southwestern United States. He was seen as a local expert and was a chief pilot at a charter company nearby. Opportunity for American pilots is mostly concentrated at various passenger and cargo airlines. For a pilot committed to general aviation, that's a recipe for unmet career expectations. That's real pressure. Unmanaged, that's pressure that potentially interferes with explicit processing and judgment. I mention judgment because I don't believe this pilot had much experience or training in conducting flight tests. There is no restriction that prevents any pilot from test flying an airplane they are certified to fly. However, there is some guidance and best practices offered by the FAA for amateur-built and certified airplanes. Among other things, all of them suggest some amount of taxi testing before an airplane's first flight. By building up a protocol to test the plane, the pilot incrementally becomes more familiar with the airframe while maintaining some presence of mind for escapes, etc. From statements on the NTSB docket, we know that this airplane was given some engine runs, with only a limited amount of taxiing in the hangar area, and then taken straight to the runway for its first flight with the customer aboard. Now, if it was me, this would raise some red flags because spare performance is really valuable. The first flight, followed by the first few hours, are the riskiest time for any new airplane. There are a lot of ways that spare performance can be critical to the safe outcome of the flight. Any observations the owner was going to make about the performance of the airplane or its motor could just as easily have been handled with a GoPro camera. People can agree or disagree with my assessment, but my income is not dependent on my local reputation. I can comfortably tell somebody to find another test pilot and I'll be just fine. For someone whose livelihood depends on the local flying scene, it's much tougher to tell a customer to stay behind or to find somebody else. Just 15 seconds into the takeoff, the 75-hour customer was directing the 13,000-hour pilot on how to apply the throttle. The pilot was slowly applying power. During the takeoff roll, there was a small swerve and bank. The customer directed the pilot to apply full power abruptly for directional control. This may have loaded some faulty responses into the pilot's muscle memory. The crew interactions appear to describe actions from an improperly briefed crew. I'm not saying the customer was in the wrong either. He hired a respected expert. So if the customer's input wasn't helpful, it's at least understandable. What we are watching is a pilot who is overwhelmed and he's reacting in similar ways to other pilots. When the controls stop moving, his implicit processing is failing. At an implicit level, his mind will return to something that provides a sense of control or a sense of safety, even if it's the wrong thing. In this case, it's reverting to a power application that worked with a similar control challenge just minutes earlier. When that fails, the pilot is further overwhelmed. Rudder and aileron inputs are limited until the airplane comes to a stop. If we let ourselves become overwhelmed and we cut ourselves off from escape routes, we could wind up doing something similar. Every pilot needs some way to avoid task saturation. You have to know yourself and be honest with yourself. How do you feel right now? And how are you going to feel if you have to use some of your alternative options? For example, this little airport by a tourist destination in Illinois is a one-way in and one-way out airport. If I hype myself and my passengers up for a trip directly into this little town, I'm putting a lot of pressure on myself to hold to plan A. There are a lot of ways to manage these pressures. For example, some pilots like to treat getting into their first destination as a bonus rather than treat diverting as some kind of second-rate outcome. However you choose to navigate the pressures around a trip, the important thing is that you recognize these pressures exist. Once we're flying, many of us are familiar with approach briefings. The briefing gets us to do some analysis and make some decisions before we're busy when we're close to the ground. We can do the same thing again as we fly over the airport. It's now, as we're over the airport, that we see how the grass or snow is behaving as air passes over and around nearby trees and buildings. It's now where we see if the runway is damaged, contaminated, or other things that might make our footwork more sporty. And it's now that we get a chance to review two important things. First, we review our anticipated control demands and challenges. This is also where we get a final gut check about how we feel about doing this thing. If we don't feel right, we're not going to think right. If you feel good about things, you're going to be thinking right. Go ahead and land. Most losses of directional control on the ground happen in only light winds, so please don't skip the few seconds it takes to think about control needs for a landing or for a go-around. But let's say that we don't have a warm, fuzzy feeling about this. Winds are out of the northwest and they're pretty strong as reported by an airport only 15 miles away. We are expecting a little bit of turbulence on the lee side of this thicket of trees, but now there's a new consideration. At pattern altitude, we're flying into 40 knots of wind, but on the ground, there's only 5. The sun is getting low and the ground is frozen from a long period of sub-zero temperatures. Am I going to get walloped at 50 feet? If we are feeling unsure about the landing, we don't have to land. Instead, we can make a low approach at a speed that's just a little bit higher than normal approach speeds. This way we have enough energy to handle surprises, and we can get an idea of just how busy we're going to get if we try to land for real. Here's that bump from the trees, and here's a little bit of turbulence. But all in all, it's not too bad. I feel good about landing here, so now I run my checklists, I do a quick review of controls to prime my brain, and I land. So let's see what happens if we don't feel good about a landing. Here's the Cub doing a low approach in entirely too much wind from the left. I'll make the airspeed indicator big so you can get an idea of the gusts and turbulence. A quick aside about control. The Cub scrapes its wingtip at about this bank angle. I limit myself to about half of that. If I'm about halfway to burying my wingtip while I'm still flying, I know I'm going to be struggling for control options later on in the landing. That's a lot of bank while I'm still pretty fast. I don't feel good about this landing, so I go to a more favorable runway. We are using high and low recons to help us decide if we will accept or reject the landing, the runway, etc. High and low recons, I'll call them inspection passes. They allow us to judge the conditions and decide whether or not we'll land. This doesn't only make us better informed, it shifts some of the judgment calls we have to make away from dangerous times, like when we're close to the runway and out of energy, to safer times, like when we're up high, away from terrain, when we have spare mental capacity to think about these things. How you fly your inspections is going to depend on what you're trying to learn. Feeling out the winds over the runway is going to require different planning and execution than surveying the surface for rocks and soft spots. I can't do the subject justice here, but know that this is not a one-size-fits-all type of thing. Trust your gut feelings. If it doesn't feel right, there's a reason, do something else, or go somewhere else. Of course, the vast majority of landings don't require any inspections at all. Usually, we feel fine about things. The problem often is not about meeting extreme challenges, it's about adjusting to a change that's well within our envelope of capabilities, but with a new mix of factors. Remember that Missouri study, the one where most deviations occurred when pilots got busy, but before they decided to adjust to a new reality? To show how little changes make a big difference, we're going to fly this airplane on a breezy day, but we're going to fly it in configurations that we'd use on a calm day. On one trial, we're going to fly it just like we would on a calm day and watch what happens. On another trial, we're going to fly it just like we would on a calm day, except somewhere in the takeoff roll, we'll realize that a change is needed. So we'll be a little bit more deliberate about lifting the tail, and we'll be a little bit more deliberate about the takeoff attitude and our initial liftoff speed. So even though it would be appropriate to fly with no flaps or use a more favorable runway, we're demonstrating how just a small change makes a big difference. We're not demonstrating how to do this right. Lifting the tail soon and taking a soft field takeoff attitude, you see the airplane wants to weather vane. I miscontrol the correction, but the heading change triggers me to check ailerons, get the plane straightened out. Not pretty, lots of work. With the same configuration, I'm deliberately feeling control authority before I lift the tail and lose tailwheel steering. We take a lower attitude in the takeoff roll and have a much easier time controlling the plane to a slightly faster liftoff speed. Much easier. Imagine how easy this would have been if I did a no-flap takeoff. Here's a picture of maximum heading change for both takeoffs. You can see one is careening off the side of the runway. The other is still more or less pointed at the far end of the runway. Here's the same thing demonstrated for landing. So on this first demo, I'm landing a little bit long to manage some contingency options. Once again, we are simulating a commitment to landing like it's a calm day. Our approach and touchdown speeds are slow. At these speeds, gust margins are tight, so when we do get a gust, we also get a bounce. If I try to salvage this, I'll be putting the airplane into a situation with poor ground contact and decaying aerodynamic control. So I end the demo and go around. Just like before, we'll simulate a late realization that conditions have changed. We're using the same full flap configuration, but this time our 50-foot airspeed is about 10 knots faster. Our touchdown attitude is lower, meaning we're touching down just a little bit faster as well. We're also going to use a flap retraction to transfer weight from the wings to the main wheels and settle the tail before our aerodynamic control authority decays. Here's a side-by-side comparison of conditions at 50 feet. You can see the correction on the right side is only about a degree or so lower pitch. And here's the difference in touchdown attitude. About a degree lower on the right side translates to only about 5 miles per hour faster on touchdown. Here's a comparison of the outcomes. On the left, we had to go around in order to avoid an unacceptably risky situation. On the right, we had a relatively mellow approach and landing, so even very late in the game, and even after many missed opportunities and many mistakes, just small adjustments can still make all of the difference. In a tricycle gear plane, we'd be seeing similar differences, but the touchdown attitude would be higher to protect the nose wheel. These subtle changes are just as consequential on the fair weather days most recreational pilots find themselves enjoying. And it's this that really drives my point. Far beyond any particular technique or any critical error or recovery, the single most important factor for any flight is a pilot that is mentally engaged with the real-world conditions they face. Remember this dumb cartoon brain gauge that I drew? Avoiding challenges seems like an intuitive way of helping your flight have safe outcomes. The problem is our capabilities atrophy to a point where previously comfortable conditions become challenging. In order to meet the challenges we'll face, we have to maintain our capabilities, and we have to do so in a variety of ways. If we don't train hard enough, we atrophy. And if we train too hard, we go too far and we get ourselves into trouble. So we have to be Goldilocks. We have to train just right. For rough guidance, you should feel like you're working for it without feeling like you're struggling to hold on. A final note about that red Kitfox crash. I tried reaching out to the people involved. I only heard back from one pilot who was asked to do the flight, but didn't. I took my best guess at what may have played out based on the NTSB docket and Google searches. I'm open to making corrections as necessary. This video wasn't short. Thank you for taking the time to watch it.